Among the rain-soaked streets of 1970s New York, where steam rose from manholes and neon lights bled into puddles, there was one image so common it became invisible: the yellow checker marathon taxi. Square-bodied, indestructible, crawling through every corner like the heartbeat of the city itself. We see them in Taxi Driver, in The Godfather, in hundreds of forgotten films, not as props, but as the very soul of urban America. A taxi so tough, one of them ran for nearly 1 million miles on the same steel frame. A company so dominant, it defined what a taxi should look like for half a century. And then, in July 1982, without warning, without ceremony, it all ended. The factory went silent. The yellow giants stopped rolling off the line. And America's most legendary taxi vanished as if it had never existed. But the strangest part? No one saw it coming. How does a company that built the toughest, most iconic vehicle in American history simply disappear? How does a taxi that refused to die quietly fade into history? The answer begins not in a boardroom, not on Wall Street, but on the cold docks of Ellis Island in 1913, where a 19-year-old immigrant named Morris Markin had to borrow $25 from a janitor just to enter the country. That borrowed quarter-century would become the Checker Marathon, and its fall would be written in oil, fire, and the weight of an era that refused to wait. Act 2, Origin Story, The Founder. The story of the Checker Marathon doesn't begin in a factory. It begins in Smolensk, Russia, in 1893, where a boy named Morris Markin was born into poverty. By 1913, as Europe edged toward war, Morris made a decision that would change everything. He would leave Russia and bet his life on America. But when his ship docked at Ellis Island, reality hit hard. Immigration officials had a rule: every immigrant needed at least $25 in their pocket to enter. Proof they wouldn't become a burden. Morris had nothing. Not a single dollar. Without that money, the gate wouldn't open. So he did the only thing he could. He found a janitor working in the immigration hall and borrowed $25 from a complete stranger. A desperate gamble. A loan he had no way of repaying. The janitor said yes. The gate opened. And Morris Markin stepped onto American soil with empty pockets and a debt weighing on his chest. Chicago became his starting point. He found work in a tailor shop on the South Side, stitching suits for pennies. Morris worked 16-hour days, saved every cent, and within a few years did the impossible. He bought the shop where he had once been just another employee. The business grew. And Morris kept a promise. He brought his entire family to America. 7 brothers. 2 sisters. One by one, he erased the borders that had once held them back. Then in 1917, everything accelerated. World War I broke out, and the U.S. government needed military uniforms. Morris Markin, the immigrant who had once begged for $25, suddenly held a contract with the United States Army. His shop ran day and night. And for the first time, Morris had real capital. But he wasn't interested in making clothes anymore. He started looking at the taxi business. Cars were flooding American cities. Fortunes were being made by men who controlled fleets. Morris saw an opportunity, not to drive taxis, but to build them. In 1919, a body shop called Lombard Auto Body came to him drowning in debt. Morris lent them $15,000. 2 years later, they went bankrupt. Instead of demanding his money back, Morris took over the shop. Then Commonwealth Motors, another struggling taxi assembler, approached him. Morris merged both failing companies into one. And in 1922, Checker Cab Manufacturing Company was born. No headlines. No celebration. Just a small taxi company far from Detroit's giants. But it carried the soul of a man who had survived on borrowed money and refused to quit. Then Morris did something revolutionary. Checker became the first taxi company in America to hire African-American drivers and require all drivers to pick up every passenger, regardless of race. In the 1920s, that was dangerous. Radical. But Checker didn't just sell cars. It redefined what a taxi company could stand for. The Checker Marathon was still decades away. But the man who would create it had already survived Ellis Island and war. And soon he would face something even more brutal, the taxi wars. Act 3, the taxi wars crisis. But just as Checker began to establish itself, just as Morris thought he had finally escaped the chaos of survival, the streets caught fire. In 1929, Morris Markin made a decision that would pull him into the most violent chapter of his life. He purchased Yellow Cab from a businessman named John Hertz. On paper, it seemed smart. Yellow Cab was one of the biggest taxi operations in Chicago and New York. Owning it meant controlling territory, controlling revenue, controlling the game. But what Morris didn't fully understand was that in the taxi business of the 1920s, territory wasn't negotiated. It was fought for. The moment the deal closed, the war began. Chicago's South Side became a battlefield. New York's streets turned into hunting grounds. Rival taxi companies, backed by organized crime and gangs who had learned violence during Prohibition, began targeting checker drivers. Cars were set on fire in broad daylight. Drivers were pulled from their cabs and beaten unconscious on street corners. Bricks flew through windshields. Bullets shattered rear windows. This wasn't competition. This was extermination. Checker stood at the center of the storm, and Morris Markin, the immigrant who had once borrowed $25 just to enter the country, now had enemies willing to kill to protect their turf. The violence escalated week by week. Taxi drivers started carrying weapons. Some refused to pick up fares in certain neighborhoods. Others quit entirely, too terrified to roll into streets where competitors hired thugs to destroy anyone wearing the wrong company patch. And then, one night in 1923, the war came to Morris Markin's doorstep. He was home with his family when they heard it. A crash, then fire. Someone had thrown a firebomb through the window. Flames exploded across the front of the house, eating through curtains, crawling up walls, filling rooms with black smoke. Morris grabbed his wife and children and pulled them out the back door just as the fire consumed the entrance. No one was hurt. But the message was unmistakable. Stay in this city, and you're dead. Morris Markin stood in the ashes of his burned home and realized something that would save Checker's future. If he stayed in Chicago, the company would be destroyed. Not by competition, by violence. So he made the hardest decision of his life. He packed up everything, every machine, every worker, every stamping die and welding torch, and moved the entire operation to Kalamazoo, Michigan. A quiet city, far from the gangs, far from the fire. It wasn't retreat. It was survival. And in Kalamazoo, away from the war zone, Checker Motors would finally have room to breathe. Room to build. Room to create the taxi that would one day own America's streets. But the peace wouldn't last long. Because in October 1929, the entire country was about to collapse. Act 4. The Great Depression and Cord Takeover. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. And with it, America's economy shattered like glass. Factories closed. Banks failed. Millions lost their jobs overnight. The streets that had once roared with traffic fell silent. And the taxi industry, dependent on people who could afford to pay for rides, was hit harder than almost any other business. Checker Motors, now safely tucked away in Kalamazoo, suddenly found itself drowning. Sales vanished. Customers had no money. Taxi operators couldn't afford to buy new cars. The factory that had escaped the taxi wars now faced something far worse: economic extinction. By 1932, the losses were so severe that Morris Markin was forced to step down as chairman. The company he had built from borrowed money and burned-out competitors was slipping through his fingers. And that's when a shadow appeared over the entire operation. His name was Errett Laban Cord, a mogul, a legend in the automotive world. The man behind Auburn, Cord, and Duesenberg, some of the most beautiful, most expensive cars America had ever seen. Cord didn't just build vehicles. He built empires. And when he looked at Checker Motors, he saw something small, weak, and easy to swallow. In 1932, Cord officially took control of Checker. Morris Markin, the immigrant who had survived Ellis Island and the taxi wars, was out. And under Cord's leadership, Checker entered a strange, hybrid era. The taxis started blending Cord's elegant design philosophy with Checker's brutally practical roots. It looked like a company being pulled between two worlds. But the strangest part wasn't the cars. It was what happened on Wall Street. Checker stock had been forgotten, trading at around $7 per share. Worthless in the eyes of most investors. But then quietly it started to rise. Small by orders at first, then larger ones. All coming from accounts connected to shell companies. Companies that, when traced back, led directly to Errett Laban Cord. The stock climbed to $15. Then $20. Then $40. Within weeks, Checker stock became one of the most irrational phenomena in American finance. While the nation drowned in unemployment and bankruptcy, Checker's stock hit $69 per share. Nearly a tenfold increase. In the middle of the Great Depression, the Securities and Exchange Commission noticed. They stepped in. And when they traced every transaction, peeled back every shell company, every hidden account, all roads led to the same place: Cord. He had been manipulating the stock, pumping it up. And when the SEC investigation exploded into public view, the entire Auburn-Cord-Wessenberg empire, already weakened by the Depression, began to crack. Stock values plunged. Banks tightened their grip. The financial markets turned their backs on Cord. And then, as if fate had written it, Morris Markin returned. With the stubbornness of a man who had once survived on a borrowed $25, Markin gathered every remaining ounce of strength and bought Checker back. Just before the Cord empire collapsed entirely, he didn't just save the company. He reclaimed its soul. And now, finally free from manipulation and corporate games, Checker could focus on what it did best, building taxis that refused to die. ACT 5. World War II and Post-War Innovation. In the late 1930s, with Morris Markin back in control, Checker introduced the Model A in 1939. A taxi that embodied a new spirit. No partition between driver and passenger. A driver's seat adjustable in 15 directions. Heating. Sightseeing roof glass so passengers could gaze at the city as they rode. Checker wasn't just taking people where they needed to go, it was bringing them into the urban experience. But then, in 1941, everything stopped. World War II broke out, and the United States government ordered all civilian vehicle production to halt. The assembly lines that had once stamped taxi frames now echoed with different sounds. Steel being shaped into military trailers. Reinforced structures built for rescue vehicles. And most notably, a Jeep prototype with four-wheel drive powering both axles, technology far ahead of its time. Checker's Jeep prototype was tested by the military in brutal conditions. Steep terrain. Endurance trials lasting for hours. Although it didn't win a mass production contract, it proved something important. A small company in Kalamazoo could still create advanced military technology. Once again, Checker proved it could bend with the times without breaking. But when World War II ended and America entered a period of reconstruction, Checker faced a challenge unlike anything before. All of its old stamping dies had been destroyed or damaged during the war. The frames that once supported the Model A were now only memories. Markin was forced to start from the beginning. Not to repair, but to rebirth. To keep pace with the new era, he brought in two of the industry's top design minds, Herbert Snow, who had created the bold lines of Studebaker, and Ray Dietrich, the legendary luxury car designer of the 1930s. Both introduced a completely different way of thinking. Checker couldn't survive on durability alone. They needed a taxi of the future. And so, a series of ambitious projects emerged. First were the Model B and C, taxis with rear-mounted engines, cavernously spacious passenger cabins, and face-to-face seating like a train car. The ideas were beautiful, but reality was brutal. Production costs soared. Vehicle balance became difficult to control. Engine cooling turned into a nightmare. The project was cancelled while still in the testing stage. Then came the Model D, the boldest creation in Checker's history. Front-wheel drive. Transverse engine. Technology a full decade ahead of Detroit. A 112-inch wheelbase and a design optimized for urban life. In testing, the Model D ran more than 100,000 miles with impressive efficiency. It showed a future where Checker could escape the shadow of being just a traditional taxi maker. But the price of realizing that future was too high. The production line would need to be completely replaced. Maintenance costs were steep. And drivers feared the risks of a new system. A small company like Checker couldn't pursue a technological revolution that even the big three were hesitant to embrace. In the end, Markin had to return to reality. In 1946, Checker introduced the Model A2, a temporary solution, blending an old chassis with a new body. Not flashy, not groundbreaking, but enough to keep the company alive in the turbulent post-war years. The dream of innovation had collided with the hard truth of economics. But Checker survived. And soon, it would create something that would outlast them all. Act 6. The Golden Era Checker Marathon Birth. By 1956, Checker had learned its lesson. Innovation was expensive. Experiments could kill a small company. So instead of chasing the future, Checker did something smarter. It defined what a taxi should be. And that year, the Model A8 was introduced. The moment when the classic Matchbox silhouette of Checker was officially born. A 120-inch wheelbase, mandated by New York City regulations. A square body designed to maximize interior space. A long hood for easy engine service. And doors as wide as garage openings, so passengers could step in and out without obstruction. Every inch of the A8 was built for one purpose: to work, to survive, to never give up. But the real legend arrived in 1961. The Checker Marathon. This wasn't just another taxi. This was a vehicle that would outlive any commercial car in modern history. 20 consecutive years of production, from 1961 to 1982. A record even the giants of Detroit had never reached. The Marathon was simple, sturdy, and so easy to repair that drivers described it as a truck disguised as a taxi. They loved it because it refused to die. Or if it did, it practically fixed itself with a few tools from the glove box. Taxi historian Mike Angelic would later say, the Marathon wasn't just a cab, it was a philosophy, simple, tough, and immortal. The Marathon's design was brutally practical. The body-on-frame construction meant you could drop the entire drivetrain and replace it in hours. The suspension was so overbuilt that potholes felt like suggestions. And the interior? Spacious enough to fit 6 passengers comfortably, with legroom that made modern sedans feel like coffins. In 1962, Checker made a strategic decision that would keep the Marathon alive for 2 decades. They abandoned Continental engines, which were durable but unprofitable due to low production volume. Instead, Checker adopted engines and components from General Motors, ranging from the 3.8-liter inline-six to the stronger 4.6-liter V8. Depending on GM allowed Checker to cut costs, while drivers enjoyed greater power and reliability. It was a compromise, but it was smart. The Marathon became the soul of American cities. In New York, in Chicago, in Boston, you could stand on any corner and within minutes, a yellow Marathon would roll past. That square silhouette became synonymous with urban life. If you needed a ride, you looked for that shape, that color, that unmistakable profile. But while the Marathon dominated the taxi world, Checker made a fatal mistake. They tried to break into the personal car market. They introduced the Marathon and Superba as family vehicles, essentially the same taxi, but marketed to everyday Americans. The idea was simple: if taxi drivers love it, why wouldn't families? But Americans didn't want to drive a car they were used to hailing from a curb. The Marathon was iconic as a taxi. As a personal vehicle, it felt awkward, outdated. Sales collapsed from over 1,000 units per year to fewer than 1,000 total after 1969. The Marathon was a great car, but it was born into the wrong market. Still, in the taxi world, nothing could touch it. By the early 1970s, the Checker Marathon was the king. And Mike Angelica's research would later reveal why. It wasn't just durable, it was nearly indestructible. One Marathon in New York ran for almost 1 million miles on the same frame. No modern vehicle has ever replicated that. But the world was changing. And the Marathon, for all its toughness, couldn't change with it. Act 7. The Slow Death. By the early 1970s, the world around Checker Motors began to shift in ways the company couldn't control. Detroit was changing. The big three, Ford, GM, Chrysler, had moved to unibody construction, automated assembly lines, and new stamping dies every few years. They could produce cars faster, cheaper, and lighter than ever before. Meanwhile, Checker was still using the same stamping dies from 20 years earlier. The Marathon's body panels were hand-welded. Its body-on-frame construction was as heavy as a safe. And every single car required hours of manual labor that Detroit had long ago automated. The result? A new Checker Marathon cost as much as a Buick. But the Buick was prettier, lighter, more fuel-efficient, and filled with far more technology. Checker wasn't just competing with the big three. It was competing with an entire era that had left it behind. Then, in 1973, the oil crisis hit. OPEC embargoed oil exports to the United States, and gasoline prices skyrocketed overnight. Americans who had spent decades driving big, heavy, gas-guzzling cars suddenly couldn't afford to fill their tanks. Lines formed at gas stations. Rationing began. And every driver in America started asking the same question: how much fuel does this thing use? The Checker Marathon, with its heavy steel frame, large frontal profile, and outdated engine technology, was a disaster in this new reality. It consumed fuel like a truck. And in an America tightening its belt because of gas prices, those hefty yellow taxis suddenly became financial burdens. Fleet operators started looking elsewhere. Toyota, Datsun, Honda. Japanese imports were flooding the market, smaller, lighter, and far more fuel-efficient. Mike Angelica's research reveals the bitter truth. Checker's downfall wasn't just about one crisis. It was about outdated technology, Japanese imports flooding the market, and a scale too small to compete with the big three. Checker tried to adapt. They swapped in more efficient GM engines. They streamlined production where they could. But the fundamental problem remained. The marathon was designed in an era when fuel was cheap and durability mattered more than efficiency. Now, efficiency was everything. And the marathon, for all its toughness, couldn't evolve fast enough. By the late 1970s, production costs had risen so high that Checker was losing money on every car it built. The stamping dies were worn out. The assembly process was too slow. The market had moved on. Fleet operators who had once sworn by the marathon were now ordering Crown Victorias and Caprices, cars that were cheaper, lighter, and easier to maintain. The Checker Marathon still ran well. But the world around it had changed. And Checker Motors, burdened by high production costs, outdated technology, and a scale far too small to compete, entered its final years like an exhausted warrior. Still standing, but with nowhere left to advance. By the early 1980s, even though marathons could still be seen tirelessly roaming New York's avenues, everyone knew the Checker era was closing. The old production lines couldn't keep up. The company couldn't afford new dies. And the profit margins had vanished entirely. The end was coming. And everyone could see it. In July 1982, Checker Motors officially ended automobile production. There were no drums, no farewell ceremony, no final parade of yellow marathons rolling off the line. Just silence. The kind of silence that fills a factory when the machines stop and everyone knows they'll never start again. The company that had survived Ellis Island poverty, the taxi wars, the Great Depression, stock manipulation, World War II, and the oil crisis had finally run out of road. The last Checker Marathon rolled out of the Kalamazoo factory, and an era that had defined American urban life for half a century quietly ended. But the story didn't vanish immediately. The marathons that were already on the streets kept running. And running. In New York City, taxi drivers who had spent decades behind the wheel of Checkers refused to give them up. They knew something the newer cars didn't have. The marathon was built to never quit. One marathon in particular became legendary. It operated as a New York City taxi for years, racking up mile after mile, shift after shift, passenger after passenger. And when it finally retired in 1999, its odometer read 994,972 miles. Nearly 1 million miles on the same steel frame. No modern vehicle has ever replicated that. Not even close. That single number, 994,972, became the marathon's epitaph. A testament to what Checker had always been, indestructible. But while the marathons lived on in the streets, Checker Motors had to find a way to survive. After ending automobile production, the company shifted to supplying stamped body components for General Motors and Cadillac. It was a humble existence for a company that had once built legends. But it kept the factory alive. It kept workers employed. Kept Checker breathing even if just barely. For 2 more decades, Checker hung on. Stamping parts. Fulfilling contracts. Existing in the shadow of what it used to be. And then, in 2008, the Great Recession hit. Demand for components collapsed. Contracts disappeared. And once again, Checker was crushed by the weight of an era that had moved on without it. In 2009, Checker Motors declared complete bankruptcy. The assets were liquidated. The factory was sold. The machines that had once built the toughest taxis in America were auctioned off for pennies. The headquarters, once the beating heart of the company, sold for under $3 million in 2010. And as if the story needed one final tragic chapter, the Markin family's fate mirrored the company's fall. Morris Markin, the founder, had faced SEC investigations and antitrust lawsuits. But even more heartbreaking was the fate of his son, David Markin, Checker's final seal. The family's entire fortune was wiped out by Bernie Madoff's financial fraud. David Markin's name appeared 5 separate times among the victims of the greatest financial con of the century. From a borrowed $25 on Ellis Island to millions built through sweat and stubbornness, to nothing. A small automaker that once carried America on its back ended not with a roar, but with the weary sigh of an era that had left it behind. The Checker Marathon didn't just disappear. It was crushed by time, by economics, by a world that stopped waiting. If this story brings back for you the smell of old vinyl seats, the rumble of an idling marathon engine at a red light, or the glow of yellow headlights sliding across rain-soaked streets from a time long gone, then you understand what was lost when Checker Motors disappeared. This wasn't just a company that built taxis. This was a company built by a man who survived on borrowed money, who escaped firebombs and stock manipulations, who refused to quit even when the entire world told him to stop. Morris Markin didn't just create the Checker Marathon. He created a philosophy: build it tough, build it fair, and build it to last. And for decades, That philosophy rolled through every American city. The marathon became more than a taxi. It became the heartbeat of urban life. The sound of its engine idling at a corner. The sight of its square silhouette cutting through traffic. The feeling of sliding into that wide back seat after a long night, knowing you'd get home safe. But the world moved on. Technology advanced. Fuel became expensive. Japanese imports flooded the market. And Checker, a small company with old machines and older dreams, couldn't keep up. Not because the marathon wasn't good enough, but because the era that needed it had ended. Mike Angelica's research makes it clear, Checker's fall wasn't about one mistake. It was about a dozen small wounds that never healed. Outdated dyes. Rising costs. Changing regulations. A market that wanted efficiency over durability. And a company too small to fight giants. The last marathon taxi retired in 1999 with nearly 1 million miles on its frame. No modern car will ever do that again. And in 2009, Checker Motors declared bankruptcy, its assets sold for pocket change, its legacy reduced to faded photographs and memories. But here's what they couldn't erase. Every time you see an old film with a yellow taxi, that's a Checker. Every time someone says built like a tank, they're thinking of the marathon. Every time a taxi driver tells a story about a car that refused to die, they're talking about Checker. The company is gone. The factory is silent. But the legend? The legend is still rolling. If you remember these yellow giants, if you ever rode in one, or if you just love stories about companies that refuse to quit until the very end, leave a small sign so I know you're still sitting in the back seat of this journey. Hit that like button for everyone who grew up hearing the sound of a marathon engine at 2 a.m. Share this with someone who remembers when taxis were built to last forever, not just until the warranty expires. And subscribe, because there are still countless Detroit legends waiting to be told. Stories of companies that built empires and lost them. Stories of cars that changed the world and then vanished. The Checker Marathon didn't just disappear. It was buried by time. But as long as we remember, as long as we tell these stories, it's still alive. See you on the next ride.